In the heart of the Arizona wilderness, where ancient red rocks touch the sky and legends are born from dust and courage, some acts of bravery transcend the boundaries between worlds. Some women discover that true strength isn't found in avoiding danger, but in walking straight through it when someone's life hangs in the balance. And sometimes, in the scorching desert where survival depends on respect for both the land and its people, a single moment of selfless courage can bridge centuries of mistrust and forge bonds stronger than blood. This is the story of how Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a trauma surgeon from Chicago, found herself facing an impossible choice in the Navajo Nation. How a woman who had spent her life saving strangers in sterile hospital rooms came to understand that healing sometimes requires walking through literal fire. And how one night of unthinkable bravery would transform not just her own destiny, but the fate of an entire community that had learned to trust few outsiders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had performed over 3,000 surgeries in her 12-year career at Chicago General Hospital. But she had never operated by the light of a kerosene lamp in a trailer that shook every time the wind gusted across the desert. Her hands, steady as granite in the most chaotic emergency room situations, trembled slightly as she made the final suture on 8-year-old Tommy Yazzy's appendix. "That should do it," she murmured to Maria Santos, the nurse practitioner who had been her only assistant during the improvised appendectomy. "He'll need antibiotics and careful monitoring, but he should make a full recovery." The trailer that served as the Pinyon Ridge Medical Clinic was a far cry from the gleaming surgical suites Sarah was accustomed to. Located on the Navajo Nation reservation in northeastern Arizona, the clinic was understaffed, under-equipped, and operating on a budget that wouldn't cover a single day's worth of supplies at her Chicago hospital. Sarah had volunteered for a 2-month assignment here as part of a medical outreach program, thinking it would be a relatively peaceful way to give back to underserved communities. She had been spectacularly wrong about the peaceful part. The reservation stretched across 27,000 square miles of high desert country, much of it accessible only by dirt roads that turned to impassable mud when the rare rains came. The nearest fully equipped hospital was 3 hours away in Flagstaff, assuming the weather cooperated and your vehicle didn't break down. For serious medical emergencies, that distance might as well have been 3,000 miles. Sarah had arrived 6 weeks ago, expecting to treat routine ailments, diabetes management, minor injuries, maybe the occasional pregnancy complication. Instead, she'd found herself serving as the primary surgeon, emergency physician, pediatrician, and trauma specialist for a population spread across an area larger than West Virginia. Her Chicago colleagues would have considered the working conditions impossible, the medical challenges insurmountable, and the isolation unbearable. Sarah had never felt more alive. "Dr. Mitchell?" Maria's voice carried a note of concern that immediately captured Sarah's attention. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." Sarah looked up from checking Tommy's vital signs to see a man standing in the doorway of the clinic. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 50s, with silver threading through his black hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His clothes were simple jeans, work boots, a button-down shirt, but there was something about his bearing that commanded immediate respect. "I'm Joseph Begay," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone choosing his words with precision. "I'm the tribal chairman. I need to speak with you about my son." Sarah had heard of Joseph Begay, of course. Everyone on the reservation had. He was widely respected as a leader who had successfully navigated the complex politics of tribal governance while fighting to preserve traditional Navajo culture in an increasingly modern world. Under his leadership, the Tribal Council had negotiated better health care funding, improved infrastructure, and created economic opportunities that allowed young people to stay on the reservation instead of migrating to distant cities. What Sarah hadn't expected was the raw fear she could see in his eyes. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward the clinic's small office. "What can I do for you?" Joseph Begay settled into the metal folding chair across from her desk, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with how to begin, and Sarah waited patiently. She had learned during her time on the reservation that rushing conversations with tribal members was counterproductive. People here operated on different rhythms, valued different kinds of communication, and respected silence in ways that her fast-paced Chicago life had never taught her to appreciate. "My son Michael is missing," Joseph said finally. "He's been gone for 3 days." Sarah leaned forward, immediately alert. Missing persons cases in this vast, harsh landscape were serious business. People died from exposure, dehydration, or simple accidents that would be minor inconveniences in more populated areas. "Have you contacted the tribal police, the FBI?" she asked. "Both. They've been searching, but ... Joseph's voice trailed off, and Sarah could see him wrestling with something. "Dr. Mitchell, my son isn't just lost. He's in the cursed canyons." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the way Joseph said it made her skin crawl. She'd heard that tone before in the voices of patients' families, when they were trying to tell her that someone they loved was beyond help, that the situation was hopeless, but they couldn't quite bring themselves to say the words out loud. "Tell me about these canyons," she said. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the red rock formations that dominated the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of stories passed down through generations. "The cursed canyons are a maze of slot canyons about 20 miles northwest of here. The rock formations there are ... unstable. Flash floods carve new channels every year, creating dead ends and traps. The Navajo have avoided that area for centuries. My grandfather used to say that the spirits there were angry, that the land itself rejected human presence." Sarah nodded, filing away the cultural context while focusing on the practical implications. Slot canyons were notoriously dangerous even under the best circumstances, narrow passages carved through rock by millennia of water erosion, with walls that could rise hundreds of feet overhead while the floor remained only a few feet wide. Flash floods could turn them into death traps with virtually no warning, and their maze-like nature made navigation extremely difficult even for experienced hikers. "What was Michael doing there?" she asked. "Being 18 and stupid," Joseph said with the bitter fondness of a parent watching their child make dangerous choices. "He's been fascinated by photography lately, especially landscape photography. He heard about the canyons from some college friends who were visiting outsiders who didn't understand the warnings. They dared him to go there and get photos that no one else had ever taken." Sarah felt a familiar clench in her stomach, the same sensation she experienced when a trauma case arrived at the hospital, and she could already see how bad it was going to be. "And the search teams haven't been able to reach him?" "The tribal police tried. The FBI brought in helicopters. But the canyons are too narrow for aerial rescue, and the ground teams." Joseph's hands clenched into fists. 3 searchers have been injured trying to navigate the canyon system. One nearly died when a flash flood hit yesterday afternoon. The FBI coordinator told me this morning that they're suspending the search until they can bring in specialized equipment and personnel. "How long will that take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. They have to coordinate with teams from Utah who have experience with technical canyon rescues. Joseph's voice cracked slightly. "My son doesn't have 2 weeks, Dr. Mitchell, if he's injured. If he's trapped somewhere without water, he has maybe another day, 2 at most." Sarah understood now why Joseph had come to her. In the absence of professional rescue teams, he was looking for anyone with medical expertise who might be able to help if they found Michael alive. It was a desperate plan, the kind that parents resorted to when all the official channels had failed. "Mr. Begay, I'm honored that you'd trust me to help, but I'm not a search and rescue specialist. I'm a surgeon. My expertise is in operating rooms, not canyon navigation. You're also the only doctor within 3 hours of here who has experience with trauma cases," Joseph replied. "If we find Michael and he's seriously injured, you're his only chance of surviving long enough to get to a real hospital." The weight of what he was asking settled over Sarah like a lead blanket. He wanted her to join an amateur search party venturing into terrain so dangerous that professional rescuers had suspended operations. If Michael was found alive but critically injured, she would be expected to provide emergency medical care under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced wilderness medics. It was exactly the kind of situation her department chiefs in Chicago had warned her about when she'd volunteered for this assignment. Remote medicine, they'd said, required accepting that some people couldn't be saved, that sometimes the smart thing was to cut your losses and focus on the patients you could actually help. Getting herself killed, trying to reach an unreachable patient served no one. "I need to think about this," Sarah said carefully. Joseph nodded, but Sarah could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. You have responsibilities here at the clinic. Other patients who need you." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the small office, staring at the medical diplomas she'd hung on the wall more to reassure patients than from any sense of pride. Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, University of Chicago Medical School. Chief Resident in Trauma Surgery, Chicago General Hospital. Board certified in emergency medicine. All of it suddenly felt inadequate, like credentials from a world that had no relevance to the real challenges she faced here. She thought about Michael Begay, 18 years old, and trapped somewhere in a maze of stone, possibly injured, almost certainly running out of time. She thought about his father, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his community, and was now faced with losing the thing that mattered most to him. And she thought about the oath she had taken when she became a doctor to first do no harm, but also to use her skills to preserve life whenever possible. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to stay at the clinic and wait for the professional rescue teams. But Sarah had not left a comfortable life in Chicago to play it safe. She had come here because she wanted to make a difference, to use her skills where they were most needed. The question was whether she was brave enough to follow that commitment to its logical conclusion. That evening, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the small community that surrounded the clinic, thinking about courage and cowardice and the thin line between the two. The desert sky was spectacular at sunset, painted in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible until you saw them with your own eyes. It was the kind of beauty that made you understand why people fell in love with this harsh landscape despite its dangers. She was still walking when she heard voices coming from the community center, a low building that served as the social hub for the scattered families who lived within walking distance of the clinic. Through the windows, she could see that a meeting was in progress. 20 or 30 people gathered in folding chairs, their faces serious and intent. "Dr. Mitchell?" Sarah turned to find Maria Santos approaching from the direction of the clinic. "I thought you might have gone home for the day." "Just taking a walk, trying to clear my head. What's happening in there?" Maria glanced toward the community center, her expression troubled. "Emergency Tribal Council meeting. They're discussing what to do about Michael Begay." Sarah felt drawn toward the building despite knowing that as an outsider, she probably wasn't welcome at what was clearly a family and community discussion. But Maria seemed to read her curiosity. "Come on," she said. "You're part of this community now, whether you realize it or not. And this affects all of us." Inside, Sarah found herself in the back of a room filled with people she recognized from her weeks at the clinic. Patients she had treated, family members who had sat vigil during medical emergencies, community leaders who had helped her understand the cultural context of her work. At the front of the room, Joseph Begay stood beside a large map of the surrounding area, his finger tracing the location of the cursed canyons. "The official search has been suspended," he was saying, his voice steady but strained. "The authorities say it's too dangerous to continue with current resources. They promise that specialized teams will arrive in 2 to 3 weeks. An elderly woman in the front row, Sarah, recognized her as Agnes Yazzie, the grandmother of the boy she had operated on earlier, raised her hand. "And you think Michael has 2 weeks? Joseph's silence was answer enough. A younger man stood up. "What about organizing our own search? Get volunteers from the community, people who know the land?" "I've considered that," Joseph replied. "But the canyons aren't like the rest of our territory. They're a maze, and they're actively dangerous. I won't ask other parents to risk their children for mine." Sarah found herself standing before she had consciously decided to speak. "What if you had medical support for the search?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. Sarah felt suddenly self-conscious, acutely aware that she was an outsider, intruding on a family crisis. But the words were out, and she found herself continuing. "I mean, if the concern is that searchers might be injured, having someone with trauma experience along might make the search more feasible. Not safer, exactly, but manageable." Joseph stared at her for a long moment. "Dr. Mitchell, are you volunteering to join a search party?" "I'm saying that I didn't come here to hide behind bureaucratic procedures when someone's life is at stake. Michael is 18 years old. If there's a chance he's still alive, don't we owe it to him to try?" Agnes Yazzie turned in her chair to look directly at Sarah. "Child, do you understand what you're offering? The cursed canyons aren't just dangerous, they're cursed. Our people have avoided them for generations for good reason." Sarah felt the weight of cultural traditions she didn't fully understand, warnings rooted in centuries of experience with this harsh landscape. But she also thought about Michael Begay, alone and possibly dying, while adults debated the risks of trying to help him. "I understand that I don't understand," she said carefully. "I'm not from here, and I don't have the connection to this land that all of you do. But I do understand that sometimes the right thing to do is also the dangerous thing to do. And I know that if we don't try, Michael Begay is going to die." The room erupted in conversation as community members debated the proposal in rapid Navajo. Sarah caught fragments of English translation from Maria, enough to understand that opinions were divided. Some people seemed supportive of her offer. Others were expressing serious concerns about the wisdom of sending their only doctor into such dangerous territory. Finally, Joseph raised his hand for silence. "Dr. Mitchell, I want to be very clear about what we would be asking of you. This wouldn't be a normal search and rescue operation. The terrain is extremely difficult, the weather is unpredictable, and if something goes wrong, there would be no way to get help quickly. You could be seriously injured or killed. I understand the risks. Do you?" Joseph's voice carried a sharpness that surprised her. "Because I'm not just talking about physical danger. The cursed canyons. There's a reason our people have avoided them. Strange things happen there. People become disoriented, lose their way even with compasses and GPS. Some who have ventured there report feeling like the land itself is hostile, like they're being watched by something that wants them to leave." Sarah fought the urge to dismiss such warnings as superstition. She had learned during her time on the reservation that what outsiders called superstition was often indigenous knowledge encoded in cultural practices, warnings about real dangers expressed in spiritual terms, because that was how information was preserved and transmitted across generations. "If you're willing to guide a search party," she said, "then I'm willing to provide medical support." Joseph nodded slowly. "Then we'll leave at first light tomorrow. And Dr. Mitchell, thank you. Whatever happens, thank you for being willing to try." As the meeting broke up and community members began discussing logistics, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and terror unlike anything she had experienced since her first solo surgery as a resident. She was committing to venture into territory so dangerous that professional rescue teams wouldn't risk it, with equipment and support that would be considered inadequate by any reasonable standard. To search for someone who might already be dead. It was also the most important thing she had ever agreed to do that night. As Sarah packed medical supplies and tried to prepare for conditions she couldn't fully imagine, she thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in suburban Chicago, she had always been the careful one, the planner, the person who researched every decision thoroughly before committing. Medical school had reinforced those tendencies, teaching her to rely on evidence, protocols, and established procedures. But somewhere during her weeks on the reservation, working with limited resources and impossible caseloads, she had begun to understand that the most important medical decisions couldn't be made from textbooks. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts, take calculated risks, and accept that doing nothing was itself a choice with consequences. Tomorrow she would find out if those lessons had prepared her for the greatest challenge of her career. Tomorrow she would discover whether her commitment to healing extended beyond the safety of clinic walls. And tomorrow, if they were very lucky and very brave, maybe they would bring Michael Begay home alive. Outside her small trailer, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and in the distance, the red rock formations that contained the cursed canyon stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky, waiting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn came pale and cold across the high desert, the kind of morning that promised scorching heat by noon but started with a bite that cut through even Sarah's heavy jacket. She stood beside her borrowed pickup truck, checking her medical kit. For the third time while the search party assembled in the parking lot of the community center. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual trauma supplies, 4 fluids, emergency medications, but her mind was elsewhere, trying to prepare for medical scenarios she had never encountered before. The search party was smaller than she had expected. Besides herself and Joseph Begay, only 4 other volunteers had been willing to venture into the cursed canyons. There was David Yazzie, Anna's nephew, and an experienced tracker who knew the surrounding territory better than anyone alive. Marcus Thompson, a former Army Ranger who had returned to the reservation after 3 tours in Afghanistan and possessed the kind of technical climbing skills they might need. Elena Santos, Maria's younger sister and a paramedic who had volunteered to serve as Sarah's medical assistant. And Tommy Begay, Joseph's older son, who had insisted on coming despite his father's obvious reluctance to put another child at risk. Last chance to reconsider, Joseph said quietly as they finished loading gear into the vehicles. His words were directed at the group, but his eyes were on Sarah. Once we enter the canyon system, we're committed. No helicopter evacuation, no backup support, no easy way out if things go wrong. Sarah looked around at the faces of her companions, seeing the same mixture of determination and fear that she felt in her own chest. These people were risking their lives based on her assurance that she could provide medical support under impossible conditions. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. "I'm in," she said firmly. And the others nodded their agreement. The drive to the canyon entrance took nearly 2 hours over increasingly rough terrain. Sarah's truck, borrowed from the clinic's modest fleet, was not designed for serious off-road work, and by the time they reached the end of the passable road, her shoulders ached from fighting the steering wheel through endless potholes and washouts. The landscape around them had grown progressively more alien as they traveled, red sandstone formations jutting from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants, sparse vegetation clinging to seemingly impossible slopes, and an overwhelming sense of vastness that made human concerns feel insignificant. The cursed canyons announced themselves with a simple absence. One moment they were driving across relatively normal high desert terrain, and the next, the earth simply opened beneath them. What appeared from a distance to be a minor crack in the ground revealed itself up close as a complex system of slot canyons, some no wider than a person could stretch their arms, others broad enough to hide buildings. The rock walls disappeared into shadow so deep that flashlights seemed to make little impact. "Jesus," Sarah breathed, peering over the edge of the nearest canyon entrance. "How deep do these go?" "Nobody knows for sure," David Yazzie replied, shouldering his pack with practiced efficiency. "Some of the slots are maybe 30 feet deep, others could be 300. The problem isn't just depth, it's the maze. These canyons branch and intersect in patterns that don't make sense. You can follow what looks like the main passage for hours, only to find yourself back where you started." Marcus Thompson was studying a collection of ropes and climbing gear with the focused attention of someone who understood that equipment failure could mean death. "The GPS readings I got from the tribal police suggest that Michael's cell phone last pinged from somewhere in the central canyon system. That's probably 4 miles in, assuming we can navigate directly. More likely 6 or 8 miles if we have to follow the passages." Elena Santos had been unusually quiet during the drive, and Sarah noticed that she kept glancing toward the canyon entrance with obvious apprehension. "Elena, you okay?" The young paramedic nodded, though Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders. "My grandmother used to tell stories about these canyons. Said they were the place where the spirits of the earth went when they were angry, where they waited to reclaim what the surface world had taken from them." Tommy Begay, who had been silent for most of the morning, suddenly spoke up. Michael didn't believe any of that. He said the stories were just ways to keep people from exploring interesting places. He was always arguing with grandfather about tradition versus progress. Sarah heard the pain in the young man's voice and recognized it immediately. Guilt was a familiar companion in emergency medicine, the assumption that somehow, if you had done something different, said something different, the crisis might have been avoided. She had learned to manage her own guilt over the years, but she had never found a way to help family members escape theirs. "Your brother's curiosity isn't what got him into trouble," she said gently. "Sometimes accidents happen no matter how careful or smart people are. Our job now is to focus on getting him out." Joseph was spreading a detailed topographical map on the hood of his truck, weighing down the corners with rocks to keep it from blowing away in the constant wind. "Based on the last GPS ping, we think Michael entered here." He pointed to a canyon mouth about half a mile from their current position. "The phone signal was lost here, deeper in the system. That could mean his battery died, or it could mean he's somewhere the signal can't reach." Sarah studied the map, trying to translate the abstract lines and elevation markers into a mental picture of the terrain they would be navigating. The canyon system looked like a vast spider web, with dozens of passages branching off in all directions. Even with modern navigation equipment, it would be easy to become lost. "What's our search strategy?" she asked. "We follow the most likely route Michael would have taken," David explained. He was carrying a heavy camera pack, so he would have avoided the most technical climbs. "We look for signs of passage scuff marks on rocks, threads from clothing, maybe footprints if we're lucky. And we move slowly enough to avoid the same mistakes that might have gotten him into trouble." They spent another 30 minutes distributing gear and establishing communication protocols. Each member of the search party carried a 2-way radio, though the signal range would be severely limited by the canyon walls. Sarah's medical kit had been divided between her own pack and Elena's, ensuring that basic trauma supplies would be available even if they became separated. Water was the critical constraint. Each person carried enough for 24 hours of hard work in the desert heat, but no more. If they didn't find Michael quickly, they would be forced to abandon the search regardless of other considerations. The descent into the canyon system began at a relatively easy slope, following what appeared to be a natural trail carved by centuries. A flash floods. The rock walls rose gradually around them, changing from waist-high boundaries to towering cliffs that blocked out most of the sky. Sarah found the transition disorienting. One moment they had been in open desert with unlimited visibility, and the next they were walking through stone corridors that twisted and turned without warning. The silence was the most unsettling aspect of the canyon environment. On the surface, there had been wind, bird calls, the distant sound of traffic on far-off highways. Here, their footsteps echoed off the rock walls, but everything else was muffled, creating an acoustic environment unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Even conversation seemed intrusive, as if they were trespassing in a space meant for silence. "First, branch point," Marcus called from the front of the group, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Sarah moved up to where the passage split into 3 separate channels, each disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. The opening they had followed from the surface continued straight ahead, but 2 other passages branched off at sharp angles, their walls polished smooth by eons of water flow. David knelt at the junction, examining the ground with the focused attention of someone reading an invisible text. "Boot prints," he announced after several minutes. "Recent ones, size 11 or 12. Could be Michael's." "Which direction?" Joseph asked, though Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. The uncertainty was clearly eating at him. "Straight ahead. The prints follow the main passage." David looked up at the walls around them, noting the way the rock had been carved into smooth, flowing shapes. "This is classic slot canyon formation. Water has been following this route for thousands of years, which means it's the natural drainage path. If Michael was trying to find his way out, he might have followed the same logic." They continued deeper into the canyon system, their progress slowing as the passage narrowed and the floor became increasingly uneven. Sarah found herself grateful for the physical conditioning that years of long hospital shifts had provided. But even so, the combination of heavy pack, uneven terrain, and constant vigilance was exhausting. The canyon walls seemed to press closer with each step, creating a sense of claustrophobia that she fought to suppress. After 2 hours of steady hiking, they reached another junction, this one more complex than the first. Instead of 3 clear choices, the passage seemed to dissolve into a maze of interconnected slots, some wide enough to walk through comfortably, others requiring them to turn sideways to squeeze between the rock walls. "This is where it gets complicated," David said, studying the confusing array of openings. "Michael's footprints are harder to track on the rock surfaces, and there are multiple routes that could lead deeper into the system." Elena had been checking her GPS unit regularly, but now she frowned at the display. "I'm losing satellite signal. The canyon walls are too high and too close together." Sarah felt a flutter of panic at the news. Without GPS, they would be navigating by map and compass, assuming the magnetic anomalies in the rock formations didn't interfere with compass readings. She was beginning to understand why the Navajo had declared these canyons cursed. The landscape seemed designed to confuse and disorient anyone foolish enough to enter. "We split up," Marcus suggested. "Cover more ground, increase our chances of finding traces of Michael's passage." "Absolutely not," Joseph replied immediately. "That's how search parties become multiple rescue situations. We stay together, move methodically, and don't take unnecessary risks." Tommy had been unusually quiet since entering the canyons, but now he spoke up with obvious frustration. "We're moving too slowly. Michael could be dying while we debate every decision. If we split into pairs, we could cover twice as much ground." Sarah recognized the tone, the desperate impatience of someone watching a loved one slip away, while medical professionals followed careful protocols. She had heard it from countless family members in hospital waiting rooms, and she understood the impulse. But she also understood why Joseph was insisting on caution. "Tommy, I know this is hard," she said, But your father is right. If we get lost or injured, we can't help Michael, and we become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. The young man's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. They chose the largest of the available passages and continued deeper into the maze, their flashlight beams cutting through increasingly oppressive darkness. The rock walls had taken on an almost organic quality, flowing and curved like the interior of some massive creature. Sarah found herself thinking about Elena's grandmother's stories, about angry spirits and cursed land, and fighting the irrational feeling that the canyon was somehow alive and aware of their presence. They had been walking for nearly 4 hours when David suddenly stopped, holding up his hand for silence. "Listen," he whispered. Sarah strained her ears, trying to detect whatever had caught the tracker's attention. At first, she heard only the usual echo of their breathing and the soft scrape of boots on stone. Then, faintly, she caught a sound that didn't belong in the dead silence of the canyons. "Someone calling for help," Elena said, her voice tight with excitement and fear. The sound came again, definitely human, definitely distressed, but so distorted by the canyon acoustics that it was impossible to determine direction or distance. In the maze of interconnected passages, the voice could be coming from anywhere 50 feet away or half a mile deep in the system. "Michael!" Tommy shouted, his voice echoing off the walls in a confusion of overlapping sounds. "Michael, can you hear us?" Joseph called, his deeper voice carrying further through the stone corridors. They waited, listening intently, but heard only the fading echoes of their own voices. The mysterious call for help did not come again. "Could have been an echo," Marcus said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Sound does strange things in these canyons." David was already moving, following what appeared to be the largest passage, leading deeper into the system. Only one way to find out. "But we need to move carefully. If someone is calling for help, they might be in a dangerous location." As they pressed forward, Sarah found herself thinking about the physics of search and rescue in such an environment. Sound would bounce and distort, making it nearly impossible to locate someone by voice alone. Visual contact would be limited to whatever lay within their flashlight beams. Even if they found Michael, getting him out would present enormous challenges, especially if he was seriously injured. But they had committed to this course of action. And turning back now would mean abandoning Joseph's son to almost certain death. Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time, trying to prepare mentally for whatever they might find in the darkness ahead. The canyon continued to narrow as they progressed, the walls rising higher and pressing closer together. Sarah had to fight a growing sense of claustrophobia as the passage reduced to barely shoulder width in some places. The thought of trying to evacuate an injured person through such tight spaces was terrifying, but she pushed the concern aside. First, they had to find Michael alive. Everything else was a problem for later. When David suddenly stopped again, Sarah knew immediately that something was wrong. The tracker was staring at the ground ahead of them, his flashlight beam fixed on something that made his face go pale. "What is it?" Joseph asked, moving up beside him. Sarah followed, then felt her own stomach drop as she saw what had captured David's attention. The passage ahead was blocked, not by a natural rockfall, but by a wall of stones that had been carefully stacked to seal the canyon. The barrier was old, probably decades or even centuries in place, but what made Sarah's blood run cold was the dark staining on the rocks. "That's not rust," Elena whispered, recognizing the same thing Sarah had seen. It was blood, fresh blood. And it was everywhere. The fresh blood on the centuries-old stone barrier created a cognitive dissonance that made Sarah's medical training war with her logical mind. Blood didn't stay bright red for long, especially not in the dry desert air. Whatever had happened here was recent, very recent. "Everyone stay back," Marcus commanded, his military training taking over as he assessed the scene with tactical precision. This could be a crime scene or worse, an active threat situation. Sarah found herself automatically shifting into trauma assessment mode, studying the blood spatter patterns the way she would examine a patient's wounds. The distribution suggests arterial bleeding, she said quietly. Multiple impact points, but not random spray. This is consistent with someone trying to climb or move the stones and cutting themselves on sharp edges. Joseph's face had gone ashen as the implications sank in. Michael tried to break through this barrier. David was examining the edges of the stone wall more closely, his flashlight revealing details that made the situation even more ominous. This wasn't built to keep people out, he said slowly. Look at the construction. The largest stones are at the bottom, smaller ones fitted carefully on top. This is meant to seal something in. Elena crossed herself, a gesture that seemed natural in the oppressive atmosphere of the narrow canyon. My grandmother's stories about the angry spirits ... She said they were trapped in the deep places, waiting for someone to set them free. Spirits don't bleed, Tommy said harshly, though Sarah could hear the fear underneath his pragmatic words. My brother is on the other side of this wall, probably injured, and we're standing here talking about ghost stories. Sarah understood the young man's frustration, but she was also beginning to appreciate the weight of the cultural warnings they had been given. The Navajo had avoided these canyons for generations, and as someone who had learned to respect indigenous knowledge during her time on the reservation, she was inclined to believe there were good reasons for that avoidance. Can we get around the barrier? She asked, studying the narrow confines of the passage. The stone wall extended from floor to ceiling, fitted so carefully into the natural contours of the canyon that it appeared almost organic. Marcus was running, his hands along the edges testing for loose stones or gaps they might exploit. It's solid work. Whoever built this knew what they were doing, but... He paused, focusing his light on a section near the top of the barrier where several stones had been displaced. The gaps were too small for an adult to crawl through, but they revealed that the wall was not as permanent as it had initially appeared. Someone has been working on this recently, he continued, probably from the other side. Some of these stones have been pushed outward. Joseph moved closer, his flashlight beam joining Marcus's to illuminate the disturbed section. Michael was trying to get out. That's why there's blood. He was working to move the stones with his bare hands. The revelation brought both hope and horror. Hope because it suggested Michael was alive and conscious enough to attempt escape. Horror because it implied he was trapped in whatever lay beyond the ancient barrier, possibly injured and growing weaker with each passing hour. Need to move these stones, Tommy said, already reaching for the barrier. Wait, Sarah commanded, her medical training overriding the emotional urgency of the situation. If Michael is injured and trapped on the other side, we can't just start throwing rocks around blindly. We could cause a collapse that would hurt him worse or seal him in permanently. David nodded, understanding her concern. And if there's a reason this barrier was built in the first place, breaching it carelessly could create new dangers for all of us. They spent the next hour carefully dismantling a section of the wall, working methodically to create an opening large enough for a person to squeeze through while maintaining the structural integrity of the remaining barrier. The work was slow and dangerous. The stones were heavy, the footing treacherous, and the confined space made it difficult to maneuver safely. Sarah found herself thinking about the stories Elena's grandmother had told about angry spirits trapped in the deep places. As a medical professional, she was inclined to dismiss such tales as superstition. But as someone who had worked in emergency medicine for over a decade, she had also learned that there were more things in the world than medical textbooks could explain. Openings big enough, Marcus announced, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air in the canyon depths. The gap they had created revealed only darkness beyond a continuation of the canyon system that seemed to extend much deeper into the earth. The air that flowed through the opening carried an odd scent, musty and organic like the smell of caves or underground rivers. "Michael," Joseph called through the gap. "Michael, can you hear us?" The response came immediately, a weak voice echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond the barrier. "Dad, is that you?" The relief that washed over Joseph's face was visible even in the harsh LED light. "We're here, son. We're coming to get you." "I can't move," Michael's voice carried through the stone opening, distorted but clearly distressed. "My leg is trapped under something. I think it's broken." Sarah was already mentally cataloging the medical supplies in her pack, preparing for a trauma case under the worst possible conditions. A broken leg in such a confined space would be challenging enough, but if Michael was trapped under debris, the extraction would be a complex operation requiring both medical and technical expertise. "We're coming through," she called. "I'm A. Doctor, try to stay calm and don't attempt to move until I can assess your injuries." Alina squeezed through the gap first, being the smallest member of the search party, followed by Sarah with her medical kit. The space beyond the barrier was significantly different from the canyon they had been navigating, wider, with a higher ceiling but also somehow more oppressive. Their flashlight beams revealed carved symbols on the walls, petroglyphs that were clearly ancient but unlike any Native American rock art Sarah had seen before. "Over here," Michael's voice guided them through the darkness. They found him about 50 feet from the barrier, trapped beneath a pile of rocks that appeared to have fallen from an unstable section of the canyon wall. His right leg was pinned from the knee down, and Sarah could see blood on his clothing from multiple cuts and abrasions. But he was conscious, alert, and responding appropriately to questions, all positive signs for someone who had been trapped for 3 days. "How's the pain?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him and beginning her assessment. "Bad but bearable. I think I passed out for a while after the rocks fell. When I woke up, I couldn't feel my foot." Sarah carefully examined the trapped leg, using her flashlight to assess the situation. The largest rock was probably too heavy for them to lift manually, but the debris pile seemed unstable. Removing the wrong stone could trigger a larger collapse. "Elena, I need you to establish 4 access while I figure out how to free his leg," Sarah instructed. "Saline solution, and prepare a syringe of morphine in case we need pain management for the extraction." Behind them, the rest of the search party was squeezing through the gap in the barrier. Sarah could hear Marcus discussing the engineering challenges of safely moving the debris, while David and Tommy worked to establish better lighting in the confined space. "Michael," Joseph's voice carried a mixture of relief and concern as he reached his son's side. "What happened? How did you end up trapped back here?" The young man's story came out in fragments as Sarah worked. He had been photographing the canyon formations when he discovered the stone barrier. Intrigued by the ancient construction and the carved symbols, he had managed to move enough stones to squeeze through the gap. Beyond the barrier, he had found what appeared to be a much older part of the canyon system, with carved chambers and passages that suggested human habitation from centuries past. "It was amazing, Dad, like finding a lost city. I was getting incredible photos, documentation of archaeological sites that nobody knew existed." Sarah noticed that Michael's description of the space didn't match what she was seeing. The chamber they were in showed signs of ancient human presence, but it was more like a ceremonial space or tomb than a living area. The carved symbols on the walls seemed to tell a story, though she couldn't interpret their meaning. "What caused the rockfall?" Marcus asked, studying the debris pile with professional interest. Michael's expression grew troubled. "I'm not sure. I was photographing some carvings deeper in the chamber when I heard this sound. Like groaning or crying, but not human. I turned around and saw the rock starting to shift on the wall. I tried to run, but..." He gestured helplessly at his trapped leg. Elena had successfully established 4 access and was monitoring Michael's vital signs, which remained stable despite his ordeal. Sarah was relieved to find that while his leg was definitely broken, there were no signs of compartment syndrome or other complications that would require immediate surgical intervention. "The good news is that this is a clean fracture," she told Joseph. "Painful, but not life-threatening. The challenge is going to be extracting him safely and getting him out of the canyon system." Marcus had been studying the debris pile and was now consulting with David about the safest approach to moving the rocks. "We can create a leverage system using our climbing gear," he said. "But it's going to be slow work and we'll need to shore up the unstable sections to prevent another collapse." As they prepared for the extraction, Sarah found herself increasingly uneasy about their environment. The carved chamber felt wrong somehow, not just ancient, but actively hostile. She had worked in enough emergency situations to trust her instincts about danger, and every instinct she possessed was telling her to get out of this place as quickly as possible. "David," she said quietly, drawing the tracker aside, "these carvings on the walls, do you recognize any of the symbols?" David studied the petroglyphs with obvious discomfort. "Some of them are familiar, but they single quotes read ... wrong, like someone took traditional Navajo symbols and twisted them into something else. My grandfather would have called this bad medicine." Elena had been listening to their conversation while monitoring Michael's condition. "In my grandmother's stories, she talked about places where the spirits went when they were angry with the living world. Places where they waited to reclaim what had been taken from them. You think this is one of those places?" Sarah asked. Before Elena could answer, they heard it, the sound Michael had described earlier. A low groaning that seemed to come from deep within the rock itself, not quite human, but clearly expressing pain or anger. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees, and their flashlight beams flickered as if the batteries were failing. "Everyone stay calm," Marcus said, though Sarah could hear the tension in his voice. "Natural caves can produce strange acoustic effects. Temperature changes can cause rock to expand and contract, creating sounds." But even as he spoke, the carved symbols on the walls seemed to shift in the changing light, creating the illusion of movement, of ancient figures stirring to life. Sarah had to force herself to focus on medical priorities, rather than the growing sense of supernatural dread that was filling the chamber. "We need to move faster," she said. "Michael's been trapped here for days, and this environment isn't helping anyone's mental state. Let's get him free and get out of here." The extraction took another 2 hours of careful work, using climbing ropes and improvised levers to safely move the rocks, pinning Michael's leg. Throughout the process, the strange groaning sounds continued at irregular intervals, sometimes close enough to feel through the rock floor, other times distant and mournful, like the cry of some massive creature in pain. Finally, with Michael free and his leg properly splinted, they began the careful process of moving him back toward the barrier. The young man was weak from his ordeal and heavily medicated for pain, requiring 2 people to support him through the narrow passages. As they approached the gap they had created in the stone wall, Sarah looked back at the carved chamber one. Last time, in the shifting shadows created by their departure, the ancient symbols seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and she could swear she saw movement in the depths of the canyon beyond their lights. "Close it," she said suddenly. "As soon as we're through, we need to seal that barrier again." Joseph looked at her in surprise. "Dr. Mitchell?" "Some things are meant to stay buried," she replied, thinking of Elena's grandmother's warnings about angry spirits and cursed places. "Whatever's back there, it's not meant for the living world." As they squeezed through the gap with Michael supported between them, the groaning sound from the depths grew louder, more urgent, as if something was trying to follow them out. And in the moment before Marcus began replacing the stones they had moved, Sarah could have sworn she saw eyes watching them from the darkness beyond ancient, angry and very much alive. The moment Marcus placed the final stone back into the ancient barrier, the temperature in the canyon dropped 20 degrees. Sarah felt it like a physical blow, not just cold, but something deeper and more alien, as if the very air around them had become hostile to human presence. Their breath began to mist despite the fact that they were in the Arizona desert, and frost started forming on the metal components of their gear. "This isn't natural," Elena whispered, her paramedic training warring with supernatural terror as she watched ice crystals spread across the canyon walls. Michael, despite being heavily medicated for pain, struggled to sit up straighter against Joseph's supporting arm. "It's angry," he said, his voice slurred but urgent. "I could feel it the whole time I was trapped back there. Something old and furious, and we just woke it up." David had his radio out, trying desperately to raise the surface team they had left as backup support. The device crackled with static, occasionally picking up fragments of what sounded like voices speaking in a language none of them recognized, guttural, ancient syllables that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in their bones. "We need to move," Marcus said, shouldering his pack with military efficiency. "Whatever's happening here, we don't want to be underground when it gets worse." They had traveled perhaps 100 yards back toward the surface when the first tremor hit. It wasn't like an earthquake Sarah had experienced those during her residency in California. This was more focused, more purposeful, as if something massive was moving through the rock itself, following the canyon passages with deliberate intent. "Rockfall ahead," Tommy called from his position as point man, his flashlight revealing a cascade of stones blocking their planned route. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the implications. They had spent hours carefully mapping their path into the canyon system, marking turns and junctions to ensure they could find their way out. Now their route was blocked, and they would have to navigate by instinct through a maze that had already proven capable of confusing experienced trackers. "Alternative routes?" Joseph asked, though Sarah could hear the strain in his voice as he helped support Michael's weight. David consulted his map, but his expression was grim. "3 possibilities, but they all involve longer travel time and more technical climbing. With Michael's injuries." "I can make it," Michael insisted, though Sarah could see the effort it took him just to remain conscious. Sarah checked her watch and felt another surge of concern. They had been underground for nearly 8 hours, much longer than originally planned. Their water supplies were running low, and the physical demands of carrying an injured person through difficult terrain would accelerate their dehydration. Add the supernatural cold that was sapping their energy, and they were looking at a survival situation that was rapidly deteriorating. The second tremor was stronger, accompanied by sounds that made Sarah's medical training completely irrelevant. It was like hearing the earth itself cry out in pain and rage, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, thrumming through the rock and into their bodies until their teeth ached and their vision blurred. "The canyon is shifting," Marcus observed with the calm of someone who had faced impossible situations before. "The passages are changing." He was right. Sarah could see it now. Walls that had been straight were developing curves. Openings that had been wide enough to walk through were narrowing, and new passages were appearing where solid rock had existed moments before. The very geometry of their environment was becoming fluid, responsive to forces that defied every law of physics she understood. "My grandmother's stories," Alina said, her voice barely audible above the groaning of shifting stone. "She said the spirits could reshape the deep places, make them into traps for anyone who disturbed their rest." A new sound echoed through the transformed canyon footsteps, but wrong somehow, as if something was walking that had never been meant to walk. The rhythm was irregular, sometimes fast like running, sometimes slow and deliberate, but always getting closer. "Defensive positions," Marcus commanded, automatically falling back on military training, even though he clearly had no idea what they might be defending against. Sarah found herself thinking with crystalline clarity despite the surreal circumstances. Her medical training had taught her to remain functional under extreme stress, to continue making rational decisions even when surrounded by chaos and suffering. Those skills were serving her now, allowing her to assess their situation objectively, even as part of her mind reeled from the impossibility of what they were experiencing. "We can't fight something that can reshape the landscape," she said. "We need to focus on getting out before we become completely trapped." Joseph was studying the map by flashlight, his fingers tracing possible routes with the focused intensity of a man whose son's life depended on making the right choice. "There's an old mining tunnel about a quarter-mile from here. It connects to a different part of the canyon system, one that might not be affected by whatever this is." The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by other sound scraping, as if claws were dragging across stone, and a low chanting in that same unknown language they had heard on the radio. But more disturbing than the sounds was what Sarah could see in the darkness beyond their lights, movement that didn't correspond to any living thing she could imagine. "Move," she said urgently. "Whatever's coming, we don't want to be here when it arrives." They began a desperate retreat through canyon passages that were actively reshaping themselves around them. Walls closed in and opened up without warning, forcing them to squeeze through gaps that had been comfortable walkways moments before. The cold was intensifying, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that it was affecting Michael more severely than the rest of them. His injured body was less able to generate heat, and hypothermia was becoming a real concern. "Elena, we need to get some heat packs on Michael," she instructed, pulling emergency warming supplies from her medical kit. As Elena worked to activate the chemical heat sources, Sarah caught a glimpse of what was pursuing them. It appeared at the edge of their flashlight range for just an instant. Tall humanoid, but wrong in fundamental ways, moving with a fluidity that suggested it wasn't entirely solid. Ancient and terrible, wearing shadows like clothing and carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated rage. "Don't look at it directly," David warned, his voice tight with controlled terror. "In the old stories, looking at the angry spirits gives them power over you." They pressed on through the shifting maze, their progress slowed by Michael's condition and the increasingly treacherous terrain. Sarah found herself administering medical care on the move, checking vital signs, adjusting the splint on Michael's leg, monitoring him for signs of shock or systemic complications from his injuries. The mining tunnel Joseph had identified proved to be their salvation, though accessing it required a technical climb that pushed their resources to the limit. Marcus rigged a pulley system using their climbing gear, allowing them to raise Michael through a vertical section that would have been impossible for him to navigate under his own power. "How much farther to the surface?" Sarah asked as they entered the tunnel, grateful to be in a man-made structure that seemed immune to the supernatural reshaping that had transformed the natural canyon. "Half a mile, maybe less," Joseph replied, though Sarah could hear the exhaustion in his voice. The tunnel was a relic from the 1920s, carved by miners seeking silver deposits that had never materialized. The walls were reinforced with timber, supports that creaked ominously as they passed, and the air carried the musty scent of decades of abandonment. But it was blessedly normal, no shifting geometry, no supernatural cold, just a simple passage leading toward the surface. They had traveled perhaps 300 yards when they heard the explosion behind them. The sound was tremendous, like the earth itself splitting open, followed by a roar of collapsing stone that seemed to go on forever. Sarah spun around to see their entrance to the tunnel, blocked by a wall of debris that stretched from floor to ceiling. "The spirits," Elena said quietly. "They've sealed us in." Marcus was already checking for alternative exits, his flashlight revealing that the tunnel stretched ahead into darkness with no visible branches or escape routes. They were committed now to following the passage to its end, wherever that might lead. "How much air do we have?" Tommy asked, voicing the concern that was on everyone's mind. "The tunnel is long enough that air circulation shouldn't be a problem," Joseph replied, though Sarah could hear uncertainty in his voice. as long as there's an opening to the surface at the other end. They continued through the abandoned mining tunnel, their progress steady but increasingly difficult as exhaustion took its toll. Michael was fading despite Sarah's medical interventions. The combination of his injuries, the supernatural cold, and the stress of their situation was pushing his body beyond its limits. "I need to stop and do a more complete assessment," Sarah announced after noticing changes in Michael's breathing pattern that suggested potential complications. They halted in a wider section of the tunnel where mining equipment had once been stored. Sarah spread her medical supplies on a relatively clean surface and began a systematic examination of her patient by flashlight. "Pulses rapid and thready, blood pressure dropping," she reported to Elena. "I'm concerned about internal bleeding from what might be more than just a leg fracture." The diagnosis was worse than she had initially feared. Michael was showing signs of hemorrhagic shock, suggesting internal injuries that could be life-threatening without immediate surgical intervention. They were at least an hour from the surface, and even if they reached their vehicle successfully, it would be another 2 hours to the nearest hospital. "Options?" Joseph asked, his face pale in the harsh LED light. Sarah looked at the limited supplies in her medical kit, then at the young man whose life was slipping away despite her efforts. In a fully equipped trauma bay, with a team of specialists and unlimited resources, Michael's condition would be challenging but manageable. Here, in an abandoned mine tunnel with only basic emergency supplies, she was being asked to perform miracles. "I can start aggressive fluid resuscitation," she said carefully. "But if there's significant internal bleeding, he needs surgery that I can't provide here." As if summoned by her words, the supernatural sounds returned, not from behind them, where the tunnel had collapsed, but from ahead, echoing from the direction they needed to travel. The ancient chanting was louder now, more urgent, and it was accompanied by new noises that chilled Sarah's blood. The sound of many feet moving in unison, as if an army of the impossible was marching toward them through the darkness. "They're not going to let us leave," Michael said weakly, his fever-bright eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. "I could feel it when I was trapped. They don't want anyone to escape who's disturbed their rest." Sarah felt a cold certainty settle over her as she realized the true nature of their situation. They weren't just dealing with a medical emergency or even a survival crisis. They were trapped between the ancient powers they had awakened and the surface world that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and with it came a new challenge that would test not just her medical skills, but her courage in ways she had never imagined. Because sometimes, saving a life required more than knowledge and equipment. Sometimes, it required walking straight into the fire. The footsteps in the tunnel ahead had stopped, but the silence was somehow more terrifying than the approaching sounds had been. Sarah could feel the weight of ancient attention focused on their small group, invisible eyes studying them with the patience of entities that had waited centuries for this moment. "They're testing us," David said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone interpreting signs that others couldn't read. In the old stories, the angry spirits don't just kill intruders. They judge them first, decide if they're worthy of mercy, or if they deserve the full weight of their wrath. Michael's condition was deteriorating rapidly despite Sarah's interventions. His pulse was weak and rapid, his skin cold and clammy, classic signs of hemorrhagic shock that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent death. But here, trapped in an abandoned mining tunnel with supernatural forces blocking their escape, Sarah's medical expertise felt inadequate to the challenge. "How long does he have?" Joseph asked, though Sarah could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer would be devastating. "Hours, maybe less," Sarah replied honestly. "I can keep him stable temporarily, but without proper surgery." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that they were watching a young man die slowly, trapped underground while ancient powers decided their fate. Elena was monitoring Michael's vital signs when she suddenly stiffened, her attention caught by something in the darkness beyond their lights. "There's someone coming," she whispered. "But it's not walking like the others." The figure that emerged from the tunnel's depths was human in shape, but moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. It was an elderly Navajo woman, though. Her age was impossible to determine. She could have been 70 or 700, with silver hair that seemed to glow with its own light, and eyes that held depths of knowledge that made Sarah feel like a child. "Grandmother Spider," David breathed, dropping to one knee in a gesture of respect that seemed automatic despite their desperate circumstances. The woman, or whatever she was, approached their group without fear, her bare feet making no sound on the rocky tunnel floor. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages, speaking in accented English that suggested vast experience with multiple languages and cultures. "You have disturbed the deep places, awakened what was meant to sleep," she said, her gaze moving from person to person before settling on Sarah. "The spirits of this place have been angry for many generations, waiting for someone to pay the price for old wrongs." Sarah found herself standing to face the apparition, her medical training warring with instincts that told her she was in the presence of something far beyond normal human experience. "We didn't mean to disturb anything. We were just trying to rescue Joseph's son." "Intent matters less than consequence," the woman replied. "The barrier was built to contain their rage, and you have broken it. Now they will not rest until balance is restored." Joseph moved protectively closer to Michael's unconscious form. "What do they want? What kind of balance?" "A life for a life," the woman said simply. "The young one who disturbed their rest must remain with them, or another must take his place. That is the old law, the price that must be paid." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with a medical emergency or even a supernatural encounter. They were caught in an ancient system of justice that operated by rules completely foreign to the modern world. The spirits wanted compensation for the disturbance, and they would accept nothing less than a human life. "There has to be another way," Sarah insisted. "Some alternative that doesn't require anyone to die." The woman studied her with those ageless eyes. "You are a healer, one who fights against death. But death is part of the balance, part of the natural order that maintains harmony between the worlds. Sometimes to save a life, another must be willing to sacrifice theirs." Elena had been listening to the conversation while continuing to monitor Michael's condition, but now she looked up with alarm. "Doctor, his blood pressure is crashing. We're losing him." Sarah knelt beside her patient, checking his pulse and respiration with growing concern. Michael was sliding into deep shock, his body shutting down as blood loss overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. In a hospital, she would have rushed into surgery, opened his abdomen, and searched for the source of bleeding. Here, with only basic emergency supplies, she could do little more than watch him die. "Please," Joseph said, addressing the woman who claimed to be Grandmother Spider. "He's just a boy. He made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to die for curiosity." "The spirits care nothing for age or innocence," the woman replied. "They have been wronged, and they demand justice, but—" She paused, looking directly at Sarah. "There is one who might be able to negotiate with them. One whose courage and selflessness might convince them to show mercy." Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. She understood now that everything had been leading to this moment: her decision to volunteer for the reservation assignment, her choice to join the search party, her willingness to venture into the cursed canyons. She was being offered a chance to save Michael's life, but the price would be everything she had. "What would I have to do?" she asked. "Walk into the fire," the woman said simply. "Face the full wrath of the spirits, accept their judgment, and prove that not all who disturb the deep places do so from greed or disrespect. If you can convince them that your intentions were pure, that you acted from love rather than selfishness, they might be willing to release the boy. Marcus stepped forward, his military training making him instinctively protective of his teammates. Dr. Mitchell, you can't seriously be considering this. We don't even know if this person is real or if any of this supernatural stuff is anything more than hallucinations brought on by stress and oxygen deprivation. But David was shaking his head. She's real. Grandmother Spider is one of the most powerful figures in our traditional stories, a teacher, a guide, sometimes a judge. If she's here, it means the situation is more serious than we understood. Sarah looked at Michael, whose breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, then at Joseph, whose face showed the agony of a father watching his child slip away. She thought about her oath as a physician, her commitment to preserving life regardless of personal cost, and the journey that had brought her from a comfortable Chicago hospital to this impossible moment in an underground maze. "If I do this," she said to the woman, "if I face their judgment, what happens to the others? Do they get to leave safely? If you are found worthy, if your sacrifice satisfies the Spirit's demand for justice, then yes, they will be allowed to return to the surface world unharmed." Elena looked up from monitoring Michael's vital signs. "His pulse is barely detectable. We have maybe minutes before we lose him completely." The decision crystallized in Sarah's mind with the clarity that came from years of making life or death choices under extreme pressure. This was what she had trained for, what she had dedicated her life to, the moment when someone's survival depended entirely on her willingness to act regardless of personal consequences. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "Tell me what I need to do." Grandmother Spider nodded as if she had expected this answer. "Follow the tunnel to its end. There you will find the fire chamber, where the spirits hold court. Enter alone, face their judgment, and accept whatever they decide. But understand, this is not a negotiation. This is a test of your soul, and the spirits will see through any deception or false bravery." Joseph grabbed Sarah's arm as she began gathering her medical supplies. "Dr. Mitchell, you can't do this. There has to be another way." "There isn't." "Time for another way," Sarah replied, gently removing his hand. "Michael is dying, and if there's a chance this can save him, I have to try." She turned to Elena, quickly reviewing Michael's care instructions. "Keep pushing fluids, monitor his airway, and if his breathing becomes more labored, you may need to assist ventilation. Marcus, you're in charge of getting everyone out when this works." Tommy, who had been silent through most of the supernatural encounter, suddenly spoke up. "Why are you doing this? You barely know us. You could just leave, let the spirits take Michael, and save yourself." Sarah paused at the question, thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. "Because that's not who I am," she said simply. "I became a doctor to save lives, and that doesn't change just because the circumstances are impossible." She began walking toward the depths of the tunnel, following the path that would lead to her confrontation with ancient powers. Behind her, she could hear Joseph calling Michael's name, trying to keep his son conscious for whatever time remained. The tunnel gradually widened as she progressed, the mining supports giving way to natural rock formations that glowed with an inner light she couldn't explain. The air grew warmer, then hot, then almost unbearably intense as she approached what Grandmother Spider had called the fire chamber. Sarah could smell smoke now, see flickering light ahead that suggested actual flames rather than the cold supernatural phenomena they had encountered earlier. Her medical training cataloged the signs of heat stress her body was beginning to experience: increased heart rate, profuse sweating, the beginning stages of hyperthermia. But she kept walking, driven by a determination that went deeper than professional obligation. She was walking toward a test that would determine not just Michael's fate, but the true measure of her own character. And whatever the spirits decided, she would face their judgment with the same courage she had brought to every medical crisis of her career. The tunnel ended at a vast natural chamber carved from living rock, its walls dancing with flames that seemed to burn without fuel. In the center of the space, figures waited, ancient, terrible, and patient. They had been waiting a very long time for someone brave enough to face their wrath. As Sarah stepped into the fire chamber, she understood that her real test was just beginning. The fire chamber was unlike anything Sarah's rational mind could process. Flames danced along the walls without consuming the rock, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories of ancient grievances and forgotten betrayals. The heat was overwhelming, but not merely physical. It burned through her defenses, stripping away pretense and forcing her to confront the absolute truth of who she was. At the center of the chamber, 7 figures sat in judgment. They were humanoid but clearly not human, their forms shifting between shadow and substance, their eyes holding the accumulated wisdom and rage of millennia. Each represented a different aspect of the natural world that had been wounded by human carelessness: the poisoned waters, the stripped forests, the sacred places defiled by greed and ignorance. You come seeking mercy for one who violated our sanctuary. The central figure spoke, its voice like the grinding of continental plates. What makes you believe his life is worth preserving? Sarah stepped forward, feeling the flames lick at her clothing without quite igniting it. The supernatural fire was testing her, searching for fear or deception, but finding instead a calm determination that surprised even her. Michael Begay is 18 years old, she said, her voice steady despite the oppressive heat. He made a mistake born of curiosity, not malice. He was trying to document something beautiful, to share it with the world, not to exploit or destroy it. Intent does not negate consequence, another spirit replied, this one radiating the cold fury of winter storms. The barrier was broken, the sanctuary was defiled. The ancient laws demand payment in blood. Sarah felt sweat streaming down her face, her medical training automatically cataloging the signs of severe heat stress her body was experiencing. But she pushed those concerns aside, focusing instead on the moral challenge before her. Then take mine, she said simply. I'm the one who chose to enter your domain. I'm the one who agreed to breach the barrier. Michael was trapped and helpless when we found him. If blood must be spilled to restore balance, let it be mine. The spirits exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes in languages that predated human speech. Sarah could feel them probing her mind, examining her motivations with a thoroughness that made medical school examinations seem superficial by comparison. You are not Navajo, a third spirit observed, its form wreathed in the green fire of growing things corrupted. You have no connection to this land, no obligation to its people. Why would you sacrifice yourself for strangers? The question cut to the heart of everything Sarah had wrestled with since arriving on the reservation. Why had she left her comfortable life in Chicago? Why had she chosen to work with underserved populations? Why was she now willing to die for people she had known for only weeks? Because healing is what I am, she replied, the words coming from someplace deeper than conscious thought. Not just what I do, but what I am. I took an oath to preserve life, to reduce suffering, to stand between people and the forces that would destroy them. That doesn't change based on race or nationality or how long I've known someone. The flames around the chamber grew higher, more intense, and Sarah realized that her clothes were beginning to smolder. The supernatural fire was no longer merely testing her, it was beginning to consume her. And she understood with crystal clarity that this was not a metaphorical trial. She was literally walking through fire, and if the spirits found her wanting, she would burn to death in this underground chamber. Many have claimed noble intentions, the fourth spirit said, its voice carrying the harsh beauty of desert winds. Missionaries who came to save souls while destroying cultures. Doctors who brought medicine while stealing children. Teachers who offered education while erasing languages. How do we know you are different? Sarah thought about her time on the reservation, about the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned. She thought about the patients who had taught her that healing required more than medical knowledge. Required respect, humility, and the wisdom to understand that she was not the savior of anyone. "You don't," she admitted. "I've made mistakes. I've been arrogant, paternalistic, culturally insensitive. I came here thinking I was bringing gifts to people who needed my help, and I've learned that I was the one who needed to be taught. But I'm here now, willing to burn for my errors, because that's what growth looks like, accepting the consequences of your actions and trying to do better." The flames were higher now, actually touching her skin, and Sarah could smell her hair beginning to singe. The pain was extraordinary, but she forced herself to remain standing, to meet the spirit's gaze without flinching. She understood that this was not just about Michael's life, it was about proving that some humans were capable of genuine sacrifice, that not all who entered sacred spaces came as conquerors. "She speaks truth," the fifth spirit acknowledged, its form flickering between human and animal shapes. "Her words carry no deception, her heart no hidden agenda. But truth alone is not sufficient. The ancient laws require demonstration, not merely declaration." The central figure rose from its position, towering over Sarah with a presence that made her feel like an insect facing a hurricane. "You claim willingness to sacrifice yourself for the boy, but words are easily spoken. Are you prepared to walk through the full fire, to let it burn away everything you are, for the sake of one young man's life?" Sarah looked at the wall of flame that separated her from the spirit's judgment seat. It was not the controlled fire of a hospital sterilizer, or even the dangerous flames of a house fire. This was elemental force made manifest, the primal energy that had forged the earth itself. Walking through it would mean accepting agony beyond imagination, with no guarantee that she would survive the experience. She thought about Michael, dying slowly in the mining tunnel while his father watched helplessly. She thought about the countless patients she had lost over the years, the ones she couldn't save despite all her training and technology. She thought about her oath as a physician, and about the deeper oath she had made to herself when she chose to dedicate her life to healing. "Yes," she said simply, and began walking toward the flames. The first step was bearable heat that made her skin flush and her clothing smoke. The second step brought pain that made her gasp, as if she had stepped into a furnace. By the third step, her clothes were igniting, and she understood that she was crossing the threshold from medical emergency into supernatural ordeal. But she kept walking. The fire enveloped her completely now, consuming her clothing, her hair, the physical shell that housed her consciousness. But somehow, impossibly, she was still alive, still moving forward, driven by a will that transcended physical limitations. The flames were burning away everything unnecessary, her fears, her doubts, her attachment to the comfortable life she had left behind. Through the wall of fire, she could see the spirits watching her progress with expressions that might have been surprise, or respect, or something deeper. She realized that few who entered this chamber ever made it this far, that most collapsed or fled before accepting the full measure of the trial. Step by step, burning with every movement, Sarah traversed the flame barrier. Her medical training told her that she should be dead, that human flesh could not survive such temperatures. But her spirit, the part of her that had chosen healing as a calling, rather than merely a career, proved stronger than biological limitations. When she finally reached the center of the chamber, standing before the seven spirits with flames still dancing across her skin, she was no longer entirely human. The fire had transformed her, burning away everything superficial and leaving only the pure essence of her commitment to healing. "It is enough," the central spirit declared, and suddenly the flames were gone, leaving Sarah standing naked and unmarked in the center of the chamber. Her skin showed no burns, her hair was intact, even her clothes had been restored as if the fire had never touched them. "You have proven your worthiness," the spirit continued. Your willingness to sacrifice everything for the life of another has satisfied the ancient laws. The boy's debt is forgiven, his life restored to him. Sarah felt a surge of relief so profound. It nearly brought her to her knees. He'll live? Michael will be okay? More than okay, the second spirit replied. The same power that tested you will heal him. His injuries will mend, his blood will flow strong again. And all who were with you in this place will be allowed to return to the surface world unharmed. But there was something in their tone that suggested this story was not yet complete. However, the central spirit continued, you have walked through the sacred fire and emerged transformed. You cannot return to your old life unchanged. The spirits of this place claim you as one who has proven worthy of their trust. You will carry their mark always, and with it, responsibilities that extend beyond ordinary healing. Sarah felt a strange tingling across her skin, and when she looked down, she could see faint patterns glowing just beneath the surface, symbols that matched the ancient carvings they had found in the chamber beyond the barrier. What does this mean? She asked. It means you have become a bridge between worlds, the spirit explained. A healer who can work with both modern medicine and ancient wisdom. The mark will allow you to see illnesses that others cannot detect, to understand the spiritual dimensions of physical ailments, to heal wounds that go deeper than flesh and bone. The implications were staggering. Sarah realized that she was being offered not just Michael's life, but a transformation of her own abilities, a chance to become the kind of healer she had never imagined possible. The choice is yours, the spirit said. Accept the mark and the responsibilities that come with it, or return to your old life and forget this place ever existed. Sarah thought about the patients she had treated on the reservation, the ones whose illnesses seemed to resist conventional treatment, the families who spoke of spiritual causes for physical ailments. She thought about the gap between modern medicine and traditional healing, and the possibility of bridging that divide. I accept, she said without hesitation. The spirits nodded in unison, and suddenly Sarah was no longer in the fire chamber. She was standing in the mining tunnel, surrounded by her companions, with Michael sitting up and looking healthy and whole for the first time since they had found him. The transition from the fire chamber back to the mining tunnel was so sudden that Sarah's companions stared at her in stunned silence, as if she had materialized from thin air. One moment the tunnel had been filled with the sounds of Michael's labored breathing and Joseph's whispered prayers, and the next, Sarah was standing among them with her patient sitting up, alert, and miraculously healed. What happened? Marcus demanded, his military training making him immediately suspicious of anything that defied logical explanation. You were gone for maybe 10 minutes, and now ... He gestured helplessly at Michael, who was flexing his previously broken leg and examining his arms where deep cuts had completely vanished, leaving unmarked skin. The spirits accepted her sacrifice, Elena said quietly, her grandmother's stories, providing context that military experience couldn't offer. Dr. Mitchell walked through the sacred fire and proved herself worthy. Sarah was still processing her own transformation, feeling the strange new awareness that came with the spirit's mark. When she looked at her companions now, she could see more than their physical forms, layers of spiritual energy, emotional wounds, and connections to the land that she had never perceived before. David carried the weight of generations of cultural knowledge. Marcus bore scars from conflicts that went deeper than his military service. And Joseph radiated a love for his children that burned brighter than any flame. How do you feel? She asked Michael, kneeling to examine him with both conventional medical techniques and her newfound spiritual sight. Perfect, he replied, wonder evident in his voice. Better than perfect, actually. It's like every injury I've ever had, every ache and pain, has been completely erased. Sarah's enhanced perception confirmed his assessment. Where she had previously seen internal bleeding, fractured bones, and traumatic tissue damage, she now observed a young man whose body had been restored to optimal health. The healing was complete and permanent, accomplished through methods that transcended anything taught in medical school. Tommy was staring at his brother with barely contained emotion. "Michael, we thought you were going to die. You're breathing." Stopped for almost a minute while Dr. Mitchell was gone. "I remember," Michael said slowly. "I was slipping away, and then suddenly there was this warmth, this feeling of being pulled back from somewhere very dark and cold. I could hear voices singing in a language I didn't recognize, and when I opened my eyes, I was whole again." Joseph pulled his son into an embrace that spoke of relief too profound for words. "The spirits showed mercy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They accepted Dr. Mitchell's sacrifice and granted you life." Sarah touched the area where she could feel the spirit's mark beneath her skin, still adjusting to the reality of her transformation. The patterns were invisible to normal sight, but glowed softly when she concentrated on them, reminding her that she was no longer entirely human. "We need to get out of here," she said, though her urgency now came from a different source. "The spirits have fulfilled their part of the bargain, but we're still underground in an unstable tunnel system." As if summoned by her words, Grandmother Spider appeared once again, though this time her presence felt less ominous and more protective. "The way is open," she announced. "The earth will not hinder your passage back to the surface world." David immediately rose and bowed respectfully. "Grandmother, we are grateful for your guidance. How do we properly honor what has taken place here?" "By remembering," she replied. "By telling the story truthfully so that others understand that the old powers still exist and still demand respect. And by ensuring that Dr. Mitchell uses her new gifts wisely." She turned to Sarah with eyes that seemed to contain starlight. "You have been marked as a bridge between worlds, child. Your healing will now encompass more than physical ailments. You will see the spiritual causes of illness, understand the connections between emotional wounds and bodily suffering, and possess the ability to heal both simultaneously." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Sarah asked, her scientific mind trying to categorize abilities that existed outside conventional understanding. "It means your patients will recover from illnesses that should be incurable," Grandmother Spider explained. "It means you will know instinctively which treatments will work and which will fail. It means you will be able to heal not just individuals, but communities, by addressing the spiritual imbalances that manifest as physical disease." The implications were overwhelming. Sarah thought about the patients she had treated on the reservation who suffered from diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic conditions that seemed resistant to conventional therapy. If she could now see the underlying spiritual components of their illnesses, address the root causes rather than just managing symptoms, the possibilities for healing were limitless. "But remember," Grandmother Spider continued, her tone carrying gentle warning, "power without wisdom is dangerous. You must learn to use these gifts carefully, with respect for both ancient knowledge and modern understanding. The spirits chose you because you demonstrated humility and willingness to sacrifice. Never lose those qualities." As they began their journey back to the surface, Sarah noticed that the tunnel system had indeed changed. Passages that had been blocked by rockfalls were now clear, and the oppressive atmosphere that had made breathing difficult was replaced by fresh air flowing from the surface. The supernatural cold was gone, replaced by the normal temperature variations of underground spaces. "The whole landscape has shifted," Marcus observed, consulting his GPS unit, which was now receiving signals again. "We're actually closer to the surface than we were when we entered the mining tunnel." Alina was walking beside Sarah, stealing glances at her as if trying to detect visible signs of transformation. "Do you feel different? I mean, beyond knowing that you have these new abilities?" Sarah considered the question as they navigated the improved passages. "Everything feels more connected," she said finally. "I can sense the life force in the rocks around us. Feel the movement of water deep underground. Perceive the spiritual health of each person in our group. It's like I was seeing the world through a narrow window before, and now the walls had been torn down. Michael had recovered enough strength to walk unassisted, though his father stayed close beside him. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, "I owe you my life. How do I even begin to repay something like that?" "You don't repay it," Sarah replied. "You honor it by using your second chance wisely. Tell people what you experienced here, but tell it truthfully. Help them understand that there are forces in this world that deserve respect, places that should remain undisturbed." They emerged from the tunnel system to find the surface world transformed by approaching dawn. The red rock formations that had seemed ominous in darkness now glowed with natural beauty, and the vast expanse of high desert stretched toward mountains painted purple and gold. By the rising sun, their backup team was waiting with vehicles and emergency medical supplies, though the medical equipment proved unnecessary given Michael's miraculous recovery. Sarah found herself trying to explain to the EMTs why the critical patient they had been prepared to evacuate was now walking around with no apparent injuries. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "healing happens in ways that medical textbooks can't explain." During the drive back to the reservation, Sarah began to understand the true scope of her transformation. When she looked at the landscape now, she could see the spiritual health of the land itself, areas where the natural balance was strong, places where human activity had created wounds that would take generations to heal. She could sense the presence of sacred sites, feel the flow of spiritual energy through the earth like an underground river. "What will you do now?" Joseph asked as they approached the clinic. "Will you stay on the reservation or return to Chicago?" The question touched on a decision Sarah hadn't consciously made, but somehow already knew the answer to. "I'll stay," she said, "at least for now. I need to understand these new abilities, learn how to use them properly. And there's work to be done here that I'm only beginning to comprehend." At the clinic, word of Michael's miraculous recovery had already begun to spread through the community. Agnes Yazzie was waiting with a group of tribal elders, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and respect that suggested they understood the significance of what had occurred. "The spirits have marked you," Agnes said, studying Sarah with eyes that seemed to perceive the invisible patterns on her skin. "You carry their blessing now and their responsibility." Over the following hours, as Sarah tried to process everything that had happened, she began to see patients with her enhanced perception. An elderly man with chronic pain revealed spiritual wounds from childhood trauma that conventional medicine had never addressed. A young mother with postpartum depression showed energy imbalances that connected to her disconnection from traditional cultural practices. A teenager with recurring infections displayed spiritual vulnerability that stemmed from loss of connection to ancestral wisdom. Each case presented opportunities for healing that went far beyond prescribing medications or recommending surgery. Sarah found herself developing treatment approaches that combined modern medical knowledge with spiritual understanding, addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms. This is how medicine was practiced before we split the healing of body from the healing of spirit, Maria Santos observed, watching Sarah work with a patient whose mysterious fatigue had baffled doctors for years. "You're bringing back something that was lost." As the day progressed, Sarah realized that her transformation in the fire chamber had been just the beginning. She was now embarking on a journey that would require her to redefine everything she thought she knew about healing, about the relationship between modern medicine and ancient wisdom, about her own purpose in the world that the spirits had chosen her not just to save Michael's life, but to become something new, a healer who could bridge the gap between worlds, someone who could honor both scientific knowledge and spiritual truth. It was a responsibility that both thrilled and terrified her, but she faced it with the same courage that had carried her through the flames. Outside the clinic, The desert wind carried the scent of sage and promise, and in the distance, the red rocks stood as silent witnesses to the ancient powers that still moved through the world, waiting for those brave enough to walk through fire for the sake of healing others. 3 months after walking through the sacred fire, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood before the largest gathering of tribal members the reservation had seen in decades. Word of her transformation and the miraculous healing abilities that followed had spread far beyond the Navajo Nation, drawing representatives from tribes across the Southwest and medical professionals from universities nationwide. The assembly hall was packed with an unlikely mixture of traditional healers, modern physicians, tribal elders, and curious academics, all seeking to understand how one woman's courage had opened a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary medicine. Dr. Mitchell, began Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a prominent researcher from Johns Hopkins who had driven from Baltimore specifically for this gathering. Your documented success rate with previously incurable conditions defies every principle of evidence-based medicine. Patients with terminal cancer achieving complete remission, diabetics no longer requiring insulin, chronic pain sufferers experiencing total relief. How do you explain these outcomes? Sarah looked out at the assembled crowd, seeing not just their physical forms but the spiritual wounds and healing potentials that her enhanced perception revealed. Dr. Hawkins carried the burden of a medical system that had forgotten its connection to the human spirit. The tribal elders radiated wisdom that had been passed down through generations, but was slowly being lost to younger people seduced by modern conveniences. I explained them by acknowledging that healing has always been more than treating symptoms. Sarah replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from absolute certainty in her purpose. Every traditional culture understood that physical illness often reflects spiritual imbalance. What happened to me in the canyon didn't create new laws of healing. It restored my ability to see the laws that have always existed. Agnes Yazzie, now in her 80s but still sharp as flint, spoke from her place of honor in the front row. In the old days, healers were chosen by the spirits, not by schools. They learned to see with more than their eyes, to touch with more than their hands. Dr. Mitchell has been given back what was taken from medicine when it forgot its sacred purpose. A young Navajo doctor named Dr. James Sosi, who had returned to the reservation after completing his residency at Mayo Clinic, raised his hand. But how do we integrate these approaches? How do we honor traditional healing while maintaining scientific rigor? It was a question Sarah had wrestled with daily since her transformation. Her new abilities were undeniably real. She could diagnose conditions that didn't show up on conventional tests, treat illnesses that had no standard cure, and achieve healing rates that astonished even herself. But explaining how it worked in terms that medical journals would accept remained challenging. We start by expanding our definition of evidence, she said. Western medicine demands randomized controlled trials, but indigenous healing traditions have thousands of years of empirical observation. Maybe it's time to develop research methodologies that can study spiritual interventions with the same rigor we apply to pharmaceutical trials. Michael Begay, now a sophomore at Northern Arizona University studying both photography and anthropology, stood up from the audience. He had become something of a celebrity on campus, the young man who had been miraculously healed in the cursed canyons, but he wore the attention with humility that spoke to his deeper understanding of what had occurred. I'd like to say something, he began, his voice steady despite addressing the large crowd. 3 months ago, I was dying in an underground chamber, and Dr. Mitchell saved my life by walking through literal fire. But that's not the most important part of the story. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The most important part is what happened afterward. Dr. Mitchell didn't use her experience to become famous or make money. She stayed here on our reservation, working with our people, learning from our elders, and helping heal not just bodies, but relationships between our traditional ways and modern medicine. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, But Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with such recognition. She had indeed turned down lucrative offers from major medical centers, prestigious research positions, and opportunities to write best-selling books about her experience. Instead, she had chosen to remain at the small clinic, serving a population that most of the medical establishment ignored. Dr. Elena Santos, who had completed her advanced paramedic training and now served as Sarah's primary assistant, stepped forward to share data that had been carefully documented over the past 3 months. We've treated 347 patients since Dr. Mitchell's transformation. Our success rate with chronic conditions has improved by 340%. Hospital readmission rates have dropped by 78%. And perhaps most importantly, patient satisfaction and community health indicators show improvements across all demographic categories. She clicked to a new slide showing detailed statistical analysis. Medication costs have decreased by 60% for our patient population. Emergency room visits are down 45%. But most remarkably, we're seeing healing patterns that simply don't occur in conventional medical practice. Genetic conditions showing improvement, autoimmune diseases going into permanent remission, psychological trauma resolving alongside physical symptoms. But how do you document spiritual healing? Pressed Dr. Hawkins. How do you measure interventions that can't be replicated in controlled laboratory conditions? Sarah smiled, remembering her own skepticism about anything that couldn't be quantified and peer-reviewed. We measure it the same way indigenous cultures have always measured healing, by observing outcomes over time, by documenting the restoration of function and well-being, by tracking the health of communities rather than just individuals. She gestured toward a large display board that Elena had prepared, showing photographs and testimonials from patients whose lives had been transformed. There was Maria Gonzalez, whose lupus had gone into complete remission after Sarah addressed the spiritual trauma from childhood abuse. Robert Yazzie, whose diabetes had stabilized when his treatment included reconnection to traditional ceremonial practices. Jennifer White Eagle, whose chronic depression had lifted after healing the cultural disconnection that modern psychology had failed to identify. Each of these cases involved conventional medical treatment combined with spiritual intervention. Sarah explained, "I still use pharmaceuticals, still recommend surgery when appropriate, still follow evidence-based protocols. But I also address the spiritual dimensions of illness that standard medicine typically ignores." Joseph Begay, who had become something of an unofficial spokesman for the transformation of healthcare on the reservation, stood to address the gathering. What Dr. Mitchell has brought to our community goes beyond individual healing. She's helping us remember that wellness isn't just about treating disease, it's about maintaining harmony between individuals, communities, and the natural world. The economic impact has been significant as well, added Marcus Thompson, who had left his military contractor job to help coordinate the expanded healthcare initiatives. Reduced emergency room visits, fewer expensive specialist consultations, decreased pharmaceutical costs, the tribal healthcare budget has improved dramatically while health outcomes have reached unprecedented levels. Marcus pulled up a comprehensive economic analysis on the projection screen. In 3 months, we've saved the Tribal Health Authority over $2.3 million in external medical costs. But more importantly, we've seen a 15% increase in workforce participation. As people who were previously too ill to work have returned to productive lives. Children are missing fewer school days due to illness, and elderly community members are maintaining independence longer. A professor from Stanford Medical School raised a skeptical question about the reproducibility of Sarah's results. "Dr. Mitchell, even if we accept that your methods work, how can they be taught to other practitioners? How do we scale spiritual healing to address widespread medical challenges?" "That's the wrong question," interrupted David Yazzie, the tracker who had guided them into the Cursed Canyons and now served as a cultural liaison for the medical program. You're still thinking like colonizers, trying to extract indigenous knowledge and package it for mass consumption. Real healing can't be mass-produced or reduced to techniques that anyone can learn from a textbook. Sarah nodded, appreciating David's insight. What can be scaled is respect for traditional healing practices, integration of spiritual considerations into medical education, and recognition that effective healthcare must address the whole person within their cultural context. We're not trying to turn every doctor into a spiritual healer. We're trying to create space for different approaches to work together. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the state veterinarian who had once investigated Sarah for animal abuse and was now studying her methods, stood up with obvious emotion. 6 months ago, I thought Dr. Mitchell's approaches were potentially dangerous, unscientific, even fraudulent. I came here today to publicly apologize and to announce that the State Medical Board is developing new protocols for evaluating integrated healing practices. She paused, collecting herself. My own mother has been suffering from rheumatoid arthritis for 20 years. Nothing we tried gave her significant relief. After working with Dr. Mitchell for just 6 weeks, she's experienced the first pain-free days she's had in decades. I can't explain how it works, but I can't deny that it does work. The discussion continued for hours, with passionate debates about the intersection of science and spirituality, the politics of medical research, and the practical challenges of implementing integrated healthcare systems. But beneath the academic discourse, something more fundamental was taking shape, a recognition that healing had always been about more than technology and pharmaceuticals. Tommy Begay, who had completed emergency medical technician training and now worked alongside Sarah at the clinic, shared his perspective from the front lines. Every day, I see Dr. Mitchell perform what can only be called miracles. But she doesn't see them as miracles. She sees them as medicine working the way it was always supposed to work, before we separated healing the body from healing the spirit. As the formal presentations concluded and people began to mingle, Sarah found herself surrounded by tribal elders who had traveled from across the Southwest to witness what they called the return of the bridgewalkers, healers who could move between the material and spiritual worlds. "You have done something important here," said Thomas Red Cloud, a medicine man from the Pine Ridge Reservation who had driven 12 hours to attend the gathering. "But this is just the beginning. There are others like you, marked by different spirits in different ways, waiting to be awakened. The old knowledge is returning because the world needs it now more than ever." An elderly Hopi medicine woman named Elizabeth Kashina approached with a group of traditional healers. "We have been waiting for someone like you," she said, her weathered hands gentle on Sarah's arms. "Someone who could prove to the modern world that our ways still have power, still have validity. You have opened a door that has been closed for too long. What Dr. Mitchell has accomplished here could revolutionize healthcare worldwide," added Dr. Chen Li, a researcher from the World Health Organization who had flown in from Geneva. "We're seeing healing rates that could transform how we approach global health challenges, particularly in underserved populations where spiritual and cultural factors play major roles in illness and recovery." As evening approached and the formal gathering began to transition into more intimate conversations, Sarah noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A convoy of vehicles was arriving, pickup trucks and SUVs bearing license plates from across the American Southwest. As people emerged from the vehicles, Sarah realized that these were tribal members from dozens of different nations, all coming to participate in something unprecedented. 500 tribal representatives, Joseph announced to the assembled crowd. They've come from as far away as Alaska and Florida to participate in a 3-day healing ceremony, the largest intertribal gathering focused on health and wellness in over a century. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. For generations, indigenous healing practices have been suppressed, marginalized, or dismissed as primitive superstition. Now, Because of what had happened in the cursed canyons, and Sarah's willingness to sacrifice everything for a stranger's life, those same practices were being recognized as valid, effective, and essential components of comprehensive healthcare. This isn't just about validating traditional medicine, explained Dr. Tsosi. This is about healing the cultural trauma that has contributed to health disparities in indigenous communities for generations. When people can access healthcare that honors their cultural identity while providing effective treatment, the healing goes much deeper than addressing individual symptoms. As the sun began to set, casting the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah walked outside to find the reservation being transformed into what looked like a temporary city. Hundreds of tents and RVs were being set up in organized clusters, each representing different tribal nations. Traditional drums were beginning to sound, and the air was filled with the smoke of sage and sweetgrass. As ceremonial preparations began, Michael approached her as she stood watching the activity, his camera capturing not just the visual spectacle, but the profound cultural significance of what was unfolding. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "About staying here, about giving up your old life?" Sarah thought about the question, considering the prestigious career she had abandoned, the comfortable lifestyle she had left behind, the conventional future she had surrendered when she chose to walk through supernatural fire. "None," she said, with absolute certainty. "I thought I knew what it meant to be a healer, but I was just treating symptoms. Now I'm actually healing people, communities, relationships between cultures that have been divided for too long. This is what I was meant to do." As if summoned by her words, Agnes Yazzie appeared beside them, moving with the quiet dignity that marked true elders. "The spirits knew," she said simply. "They saw your heart before you understood it yourself. That's why they chose you to be the one who would walk through fire and emerge transformed." Elena joined them, carrying a folder thick with documentation. "Sarah, I've been compiling reports from medical professionals who've observed our work. Over the past 3 months, Harvard Medical School wants to establish a formal research partnership. Johns Hopkins is proposing a pilot program for integrated healing techniques. Even the CDC is interested in studying our community health outcomes. And from the spiritual side," added David, "we've received invitations to share our approaches with indigenous communities in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Maori healers in particular are excited about creating international networks for traditional medicine practitioners." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what her single act of courage had set in motion. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one young man's life had evolved into a movement that could transform healthcare for indigenous populations worldwide. "There's something else," Joseph said, approaching with a ceremonial bundle wrapped in sacred cloth. "The tribal council has voted unanimously to name you an honorary member of our nation. This comes with specific responsibilities. You would be recognized as a bridge walker, someone who carries the obligation to help heal the divisions between our world and the dominant culture." The honor was unprecedented. In the entire history of the Navajo Nation, fewer than a dozen non-native people had ever been granted tribal membership, and none had been given the specific designation of bridgewalker. "I'm honored beyond words," Sarah replied, understanding that she was being offered not just recognition, but a role that would define the rest of her life. "I accept the responsibility and the privilege." As darkness fell and the first ceremonial fires were lit, Sarah found herself at the center of a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. 500 tribal members from across North America had come to honor her sacrifice and to participate in a renaissance of traditional healing that her courage had helped to ignite. The ceremony that followed lasted 3 days and included not just traditional healing practices, but workshops on integrating ancient wisdom with modern medical techniques, discussions about preserving indigenous knowledge for future generations, and planning sessions for expanding integrated healthcare programs to other reservations. On the final night, as Sarah stood before the largest sacred fire she had ever seen, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her willingness to walk through flames for a stranger, she understood that the real miracle wasn't her supernatural abilities. The real miracle was that sometimes, when you're brave enough to sacrifice everything for someone else, you discover not just who you were meant to become, but how your individual courage can light fires of hope and healing that spread far beyond anything you could have imagined. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and in the distance, the red rocks stood as eternal witnesses to the truth that some bonds forged in courage, sacrifice, and love are indeed stronger than lifetimes. The woman who had walked through fire to save the chief's son had become something far greater, a bridge between worlds, a healer of nations, and living proof that one person's willingness to risk everything for others could transform not just individual lives, but the very nature of what healing could be. The story had become legend, but the work of building bridges between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.